The night was still, the kind of silence that only comes after midnight when the world seems to be holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. Every creak of the old house sent a jolt of fear through me. But tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't going to let the fear control me. I'd been planning this for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment when my parents were too deep in their drunken slumber to notice me slipping away. The bruises on my arms and the cut above my eyebrow were reminders of what would happen if they caught me. But I couldn't let that stop me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I slowly pushed back the thin blanket and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet, and I winced as I took a step, feeling the sharp sting of the bruises on my legs. I reached for the small bag I had hidden under the bed, the one I had packed with a few pieces of bread, some apples, and a bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it was all I could manage without arousing suspicion. As I stood up, I paused, listening for any sign of movement from my parents' room down the hall. The only sound was their loud, uneven breathing. I took a deep breath and crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The door creaked as I opened it, and I froze, holding my breath. I could feel the tension in the air, waiting for my father's angry voice to boom through the darkness. But there was nothing, just silence. I let out a shaky breath and slipped into the hallway. The shadows seemed to reach out to me, and I had to remind myself to stay calm, to keep moving. I was so close to freedom. As I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. This was it. Once I walked through this door, there was no turning back. I thought of all the times I'd been too scared to leave, too afraid of what might happen if I did. But tonight, I couldn't let that fear control me anymore. I turned the knob slowly, wincing at the loud click it made as it turned. The door creaked open, and the cold night air rushed in, biting at my skin. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above, but I barely noticed them. All I could think about was getting as far away from this house as possible. I took a few steps away from the house, the crunch of the gravel under my feet sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. I was free, but the reality of what I was doing started to sink in. I had no plan, nowhere to go, and nothing to my name except a few pieces of food. As I walked down the deserted street, I heard a voice in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped, listening. The voice was faint, coming from an alleyway just up ahead. I knew I should keep walking, but something compelled me to see who it was. I slowly approached the alley, peering around the corner. There, huddled against the wall, was a man, his thin frame barely covered by the tattered coat he wore. He was mumbling to himself, his breath coming out in shaky puffs. I felt a pang of sadness as I looked at him, recognizing the same kind of desperation that I felt. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly, stepping closer. The man looked up, startled by my voice. His eyes were wide, a mixture of fear and confusion, but as he looked at me, his expression softened. "Just trying to stay warm," he replied, his voice hoarse and weak. I glanced down at the small bag I was carrying, my mind racing. I didn't have much, but I couldn't just walk away and leave him here, not when I had something that could help. Without thinking, I reached into the bag and pulled out a piece of bread. I held it out to him, my hand trembling slightly. "Here," I said softly. "It's not much, but it's all I have." He hesitated for a moment, staring at the bread in my hand. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing against mine. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. As I watched him eat, I felt a strange sense of connection to this man, like we were both fighting the same battle, just in different ways. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Noah," he replied between bites. "And you?" "Emma," I said quietly. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the cold night air wrapping around us like a blanket. I knew I should get moving, that I couldn't stay here much longer. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Something in Noah's eyes that told me he needed me just as much as I needed him. "I don't have much," I said after a while, "but I'll bring you more food when I can. Just stay here, okay?" Noah looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I shrugged, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. "Because I know what it's like to feel alone," I whispered. "And I don't want you to feel that way." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Thank you, Emma," he said quietly. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Noah," I said, turning to leave. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of determination settle over me. I wasn't just running away from something anymore. I was running toward something that felt like hope. And I wasn't going to let anything stop me from finding it. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, but the warmth of the colors did little to chase away the biting cold. I had spent the night walking, too afraid to stop, too determined to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. My feet ached, each step sending a sharp pain up my legs, but I pushed on, the memory of Noah's grateful eyes keeping me going. I hadn't thought much about where I was heading. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. I had no destination, no plan, just the small bag slung over my shoulder and the clothes on my back. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since yesterday. But I ignored it, focusing instead on the road ahead. The town was still asleep, the streets deserted except for the occasional car passing by. I kept to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the street lamps. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself. If anyone saw me, they might recognize me. And that was the last thing I needed. As I turned a corner, I found myself in front of a small park. The grass was frosted over, glittering in the early morning light, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare branches swaying gently in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way to one of the benches near the edge of the park. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but at least it was out of sight from the main road. I sat down, pulling my coat tighter around me as I huddled against the cold. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them. As I sat there, the events of the night began to catch up with me. The adrenaline that had kept me going finally wearing off. I felt the exhaustion settle over me like a heavy blanket, and I leaned back against the bench, closing my eyes for just a moment. "Emma." My eyes flew open at the sound of my name, and I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing a few feet away was Noah, his breath coming out in ragged puffs as he looked at me with a mixture of relief and concern. "Noah?" I whispered, disbelief coloring my voice. "What are you doing here?" He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes searching mine. I was worried about you," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You gave me that food last night, and then you just left. I couldn't stop thinking about you. I wanted to make sure you were okay." I stared at him, trying to process his words. "But how did you find me?" He shrugged, a small, almost sheepish smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I didn't. I just kept walking, hoping I'd run into you. And here you are." His words sent a strange warmth through me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. No one had ever cared enough to look for me, to make sure I was okay. And yet here was Noah, a man with nothing to his name, standing in front of me because he had worried about me. The thought was almost too much to bear, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "You shouldn't have done that," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You should have stayed where you were. You need to take care of yourself." Noah shook his head, his expression serious. "I couldn't just sit there and do nothing," he said quietly. "You helped me when you didn't have to. You gave me what little you had. even though you're clearly struggling yourself. I couldn't just let you go off on your own without knowing if you were okay." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm fine," I muttered, though the words felt hollow even to my own ears. "I don't need anyone's help." "Emma," Noah said softly, his voice full of compassion. "You don't have to do this alone." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my resolve crumbling. For so long I had told myself that I was on my own, that no one would help me, that I had to be strong enough to survive on my own. But now, here was Noah, offering me something I had never known, kindness without expecting anything in return. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. "I don't have a choice," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I have to get out of here. I can't go back to them." Noah nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I won't ask you to," he said gently. "But maybe you don't have to do this alone. Maybe we could help each other." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same pain, the same fear reflected in his eyes that I had seen in my own reflection countless times. And in that moment, I knew he was right. I couldn't keep doing this alone. "Okay," I whispered, the word feeling like both a surrender and a promise. Noah's face softened into a small, relieved smile. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his voice full of quiet determination. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face this world alone. Maybe there was a chance for something better, something worth fighting for. And with Noah by my side, I was ready to take that chance. The weight of my decision pressed heavily on my shoulders as I made my way back to the house I had so desperately fled from just hours earlier. Every step felt like a betrayal of the freedom I had tasted, however briefly, in those cold morning hours. But the image of Noah, frail and vulnerable, his eyes filled with a quiet desperation, was enough to push me forward. I couldn't abandon him. Not now, not when he needed me the most. The familiar sight of the dilapidated house came into view, its dark silhouette looming like a shadow over my heart. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, my stomach twisting in knots. The memories of the beatings, the harsh words, the constant fear, they all came rushing back, threatening to drown me. But I couldn't let them. Not now. "Emma, are you sure about this?" Noah's voice broke through my thoughts, soft but filled with concern. He stood a few paces behind me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of the oversized coat I had given him. The coat had been my mother's, but she had never worn it, one of those many things she kept locked away for a life she never had. Now it was Noah's lifeline against the bitter cold. I turned to face him, forcing a small smile. "Unsure," I replied, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my fear. "I'll be okay. I just need to get inside without them noticing." Noah frowned, his brow furrowing with worry. "What if they catch you? What if they hurt you again?" "They won't." I lied, more to myself than to him. "I know how to move quietly. I'll just sneak in, grab some food and blankets, and sneak back out. They won't even know I was there." Noah's eyes searched mine, his expression conflicted. "I don't like this, Emma. I don't like you going back there." "I don't like it either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't leave you out here with nothing. You'll freeze to death." He opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Please, Noah, just trust me. I'll be quick." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "All right," he said reluctantly. "But if anything goes wrong, if you need help, you get out of there. Don't risk your life for me." "I won't," I promised, though we both knew it was a lie. With one last look at Noah, I turned and made my way toward the house, keeping to the shadows as I approached the back door. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I paused at the door, listening for any sounds from inside. The house was eerily quiet, the only noise the faint creaking of the floorboards as the old structure settled. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then slowly turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, and I slipped inside, careful to close it quietly behind me. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the window. I stood still for a moment, my breath held as I listened for any sign that I had been heard. Nothing. I exhaled slowly and began to move, my steps silent on the worn linoleum floor. I knew exactly where to go: the pantry. It was small and cluttered, but it held the essentials. I grabbed a few cans of food, stuffing them into the bag slung over my shoulder, along with a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. My hand shook as I worked, the fear of being caught making every second feel like an eternity. As I turned to leave, I spotted a blanket draped over the back of a chair in the living room. It was old and frayed, but it would provide some warmth. I hesitated, knowing that taking it would increase the risk of being discovered. But Noah needed it. I couldn't leave without it. I crossed the room, my eyes darting to the hallway where my parents' bedroom was. The door was closed, and I prayed they were still asleep. I grabbed the blanket, pulling it tightly around my shoulders as I made my way back toward the kitchen. Just as I reached the door, I heard it, a soft creak from the hallway. My blood ran cold, and I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. My father stood in the hallway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. His eyes narrowed as he stared at me, and I could see the anger building in his expression. "Emma," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "What the heck do you think you're doing?" My mind raced, searching for an excuse, a lie. Anything to get me out of this situation. I was just getting something to eat," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. His eyes flicked to the bag slung over my shoulder, the blanket in my arms, and his expression darkened further. "You expect me to believe that?" he snarled, taking a step closer. My breath hitched, and I instinctively took a step back, my back pressing against the door. "Please, Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. I was hungry." "Liar," he snapped, and in an instant, he was on me, his hand gripping my arm with bruising force. "You think you can just take whatever you want? You ungrateful little—" Before he could finish, I wrenched my arm free, surprising him with the sudden movement. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the cold night air. I didn't stop to look back, didn't wait to see if he was following me. I just ran, the sound of his angry shouts fading behind me as I flooded into the darkness. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out at any moment. But I didn't stop. Not until I reached the edge of the park, where Noah was waiting, his eyes wide with concern. "Emma," he exclaimed, rushing to my side as I collapsed onto the bench, gasping for breath. "What happened? Are you okay?" I nodded, though tears streamed down my face, and my whole body shook with fear and adrenaline. "I'm fine," I managed to say between ragged breaths. "I got what we need. Let's go before they find us." Noah looked at me with a mixture of admiration and worry, but he didn't argue. He simply took the bag from me, slinging it over his own shoulder, and then gently helped me to my feet. As we walked away from the park, I couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. It stood there, dark and silent, a place that had once been my prison. But now I was free, or at least I was trying to be, and with Noah by my side, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could both escape the darkness that had held us captive for so long. The night was colder than any I could remember. The chill seeped into my bones, turning my breath into small clouds of fog that hung in the air before dissipating into the darkness. The city had always felt cold to me, but this was different. This cold was a living thing, wrapping around me, pressing in from all sides, reminding me of the perilous nature of what I was doing. I shivered as I walked beside Noah, The blanket I had taken from the house draped over both of our shoulders. It was thin, offering little protection against the biting wind, but it was all we had. Noah walked slowly, his steps unsteady, and I could see the strain etched into his features. He had grown weaker over the past few days, the harsh conditions taking their toll on him. "We need to find somewhere to stay," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "We can't keep walking like this." Noah shook his head. "There's nowhere safe, Emma. Every shelter in the city is full, and those that aren't, well, they're not places you'd want to be." I frowned, my heart sinking at his words. I had heard stories about the shelters, about the dangers lurking within them. Violence, theft, abuse. These places were often as dangerous as the streets themselves. But what choice did we have? The cold was relentless, and I could see Noah was nearing his limit. "We can't just stay out here," I insisted, wrapping the blanket tighter around us. "You're not well, Noah. We need to find some place warm, even if just for the night." Noah sighed, his breath coming out in a misty puff. "I know you're right, but I don't want to put you in any more danger. You've done enough for me already." I stopped walking and turned to face him, placing a hand on his arm. "Noah, you're not a burden. We're in this together, remember. We'll find a way to get through this, but I need you to trust me. Please." He looked down at me, his expression softening as he saw the determination in my eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was about to argue, but then he nodded. "All right, Emma, I trust you." I felt a surge of relief wash over me. We continued walking, my mind racing as I tried to think of where we could go. I had heard rumors of an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place where people like us sometimes took refuge. It wasn't safe, but it was better than freezing to death on the streets. "We can try the old factory," I suggested. "It's not too far from here. Maybe we can find a corner to hide in, just until morning." Noah nodded again, too exhausted to offer an alternative. We altered our course, heading towards the factory. The wind howled around us, the streets eerily empty as we trudged forward. I kept my arm around Noah, trying to share whatever warmth I could muster. As we approached the factory, the outline of the decrepit building came into view. It was a hulking structure, its windows shattered, the once vibrant paint peeling away to reveal the rusted metal beneath. The place reeked of decay and abandonment, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. I led Noah through a gap in the fence that surrounded the factory, careful not to cut myself on the jagged edges of the broken chain link. The inside was just as desolate as the outside, dark, cold, and filled with the eerie echoes of the wind as it whipped through the empty hallways. We found a corner near the back of the building, away from the broken windows where the wind was strongest. I helped Noah sit down, wrapping the blanket around him as best I could. His breathing was labored, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. But he tried to smile at me. "You've got a good heart, Emma," he said softly. "You didn't have to do any of this, you know." I knelt beside him, resting my hand on his. "I had to, Noah. You saved me that night, whether you know it or not. I couldn't just walk away." He chuckled weakly, though it quickly turned into a cough that racked his thin frame. "Saved you? I'm not so sure about that. You've been the one saving me." I squeezed his hand, my heart aching at the sight of him like this. "We've been saving each other," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "That's what friends do." He looked at me, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something that looked a lot like hope. "Friends, huh?" he murmured. "I haven't had one of those in a long time." "Well, you've got one now," I replied, blinking back the tears. "And I'm not going anywhere." We sat in silence for a while, the cold still biting, but somehow a little more bearable now that we were out of the wind. I leaned against the wall, trying to keep my body close to Noah's to share warmth. I knew this wasn't a long-term solution. We couldn't stay here forever. But for now, it was enough. For now, we were safe. As the night dragged on, The temperature continued to drop. My fingers were numb, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones despite the blanket. Noah had fallen asleep, his head resting on my shoulder, his breathing shallow but steady. I fought to stay awake, knowing I needed to keep watch, but exhaustion was pulling me under. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard something, a faint sound, like the crunch of footsteps on broken glass. My heart jumped into my throat, and I tensed, straining to hear over the howling wind. The sound came again, closer this time, and I knew someone was in the factory with us. I shook Noah gently, trying to wake him without making too much noise. "Noah," I whispered urgently. "Noah, wake up." He stirred, blinking groggily as he lifted his head. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Someone's here," I said, my voice barely audible. "We need to move." Noah's eyes widened, and he quickly pushed himself to his feet, though I could see it took all of his strength to do so. We gathered our things as quietly as we could, my heart pounding in my chest as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. "Let's go," I whispered, grabbing Noah's arm and pulling him towards the opposite end of the building. We moved as quickly and silently as possible, staying low to the ground, trying to keep out of sight. The factory was a maze of hallways and empty rooms, and I prayed we could lose whoever was following us. As we rounded a corner, I caught sight of a shadow moving along the far wall. I froze, pulling Noah back into the shadows with me. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and they moved with a purpose that sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible, hoping that they wouldn't see us. The figure paused, turning their head as if listening for something. I tightened my grip on Noah's arm, ready to bolt at any moment. But then, to my immense relief, the figure continued down the hallway, moving away from us. "We need to get out of here," I whispered once they were out of sight. "Now." Noah nodded, and we quickly made our way back the way we had come, slipping through the gap in the fence and out into the night. The cold air hit us like a wall, but I didn't care. We were away from the danger, and that was all that mattered. We didn't stop until we were several blocks away from the factory, finally collapsing onto a bench in a small park. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but we were safe, for now. Noah looked at me, his expression a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you, Emma," he said quietly, "for everything." I shook my head, brushing off his thanks. "Don't thank me yet," I replied, trying to catch my breath. "We still have a long way to go." He smiled weakly, the lines of worry still itched on his face. "I'm just glad we have each other," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out," I assured him, though I couldn't help but wonder how long we could keep this up. The cold was relentless, and the dangers were everywhere. But as long as we had each other, I knew we could survive. And so, we sat together on that bench, huddled close for warmth, as the night wore on and the city around us slept. The days blurred into one another as the cold tightened its grip on the city. Every morning, I awoke with stiff limbs and an aching body, the chill having settled deep into my bones. But despite the relentless weather, there was a fire inside me that refused to be extinguished, a fire fueled by the knowledge that I was no longer just surviving for myself. I was surviving for Noah too. Noah's condition had worsened. His cough, which had started as a mere annoyance, had become a constant, racking his frail body with every breath. I could see the pain in his eyes, the exhaustion weighing him down, but he never complained. He would just smile at me, as if to say, "I'm still here, Emma. We'll get through this." But I knew we couldn't go on like this. The small amount of food I managed to steal from my parents' kitchen each night wasn't enough. Noah needed real nourishment, medicine, and warmth. I had to do something, and I had to do it soon. One evening, as we sat huddled together in the corner of an old, abandoned building, our latest refuge, I made up my mind. I would confront my parents. It was a dangerous decision, one that could lead to severe punishment, but I couldn't let Noah suffer any longer. I needed to gather enough supplies to help him, even if it meant risking my own safety. "Noah," I said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between us. "I need to go back home tonight." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with concern. "Emma, you can't. It's too dangerous. What if they catch you?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I have to try. You're getting worse, and I can't just sit here and do nothing. I need to get more food, more blankets, anything to help you get better." Noah shook his head, his expression pained. "I won't let you put yourself in harm's way for me. You've already done so much. Please, Emma, don't do this." I reached out and took his hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "Noah, you've given me a reason to fight. You've shown me that I'm stronger than I ever thought I could be. But I can't fight alone. I need to know that you'll be okay, that you'll keep fighting too." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze searching mine. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right, Emma, but promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks." "I promise," I said, though I knew in my heart that keeping that promise might be impossible. As the night fell, I prepared myself for the journey back to the house. I wrapped the thin blanket around Noah, making sure he was as warm as possible before I left. He gave me a weak smile, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Be safe," he whispered as I stood to leave. "I will," I replied, though I couldn't bring myself to smile back. "I'll be back before you know it." The walk back to the house felt longer than usual. Every step was heavy, the cold biting at my face, my fingers numb despite the gloves I wore. My heart pounded in my chest, not just from the physical exertion, but from the fear of what awaited me at home. My parents would be furious if they caught me, furious and violent. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on Noah's face, on the quiet strength I had seen in him despite his frailty. When I finally reached the house, I paused outside, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. The windows were dark, but I knew better than to think that meant my parents were asleep. They had a way of lurking in the shadows, always ready to catch me in the act of defiance. But I had no choice. I had to do this. I crept around to the back of the house, where the kitchen door was. It was the least secure entrance, and I knew that if I was quiet enough, I could slip inside without being detected. My hand trembled as I turned the doorknob, but to my relief, it opened without a sound. Once inside, I moved quickly. I grabbed a bag and began filling it with whatever food I could find: bread, canned goods, some fruit that had been left out on the counter. My heart raced as I worked, every creak of the floorboard sending a jolt of fear through me. I had to be fast. I couldn't afford to be caught. But just as I was about to leave, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a footstep, heavy and deliberate, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I turned towards the sound, my eyes wide with terror. "Emma." My father's voice, low and menacing, cut through the darkness. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I froze, the bag clutched tightly in my hands. My mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, a reason why I was in the kitchen in the middle of the night. But I knew there was no way out of this. I had been caught. I was just hungry, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped into the kitchen, his face twisted with anger. "Hungry, huh? And what's with the bag? You planning on running away again, you little brat?" I shook my head frantically, tears welling up in my eyes. "No, I wasn't. I wasn't going to run. I just wanted to get some food, that's all." He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. He took a step closer, his hand raised as if to strike me, but then something inside me snapped. The fear that had always kept me in line, that had always made me submit, was suddenly replaced by something else, something fierce and unyielding. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. You're not going to hurt me anymore." He paused, shocked by my defiance. For a moment, I thought he might actually back down, but then his expression darkened, and I knew I was in for it. But before he could do anything, the door to the kitchen flew open, and my mother stormed in, her eyes blazing. "What's going on in here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusing. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. I was done for. But then, in that moment of absolute fear and desperation, I found my voice again. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady and firm. "I'm taking this food, and I'm leaving. You can't stop me." They both stared at me, stunned by my boldness. I could see the rage building in their eyes, but before they could react, I turned and bolted for the door, the bag of food clutched tightly in my arms. I ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was sure I was far enough away, until the house was nothing more than a distant memory. When I finally reached Noah, I collapsed beside him, tears streaming down my face. I had done it. I had faced my parents, and survived. I had found a strength within myself that I never knew existed. Noah looked up at me, his eyes wide with concern. "Emma, are you okay? What happened?" I shook my head, unable to speak through the sobs that racked my body. But then, slowly, the tears began to subside, and I looked at him, a small, shaky smile on my lips. "I'm okay," I whispered, wiping the tears from my face. "I'm okay, and I've got food. We're going to be all right, Noah. We're going to make it." He smiled back at me, relief and gratitude shining in his eyes. "I never doubted you for a second," he said softly. And in that moment, I knew he was right. I had found a hidden strength within myself, a strength that would carry us through whatever came next. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were fighting. And we were going to win. The days grew shorter, and the nights colder as winter tightened its grip on the city. Every breath I took felt like inhaling shards of ice, and every step was a battle against the biting wind. But I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that Noah needed me. Noah's condition had deteriorated even further. His cough had become a harsh, rattling sound that tore through the silence of our makeshift shelter. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he had grown too weak to sit up for more than a few minutes at a time. Despite my efforts, the food and supplies I brought him were no longer enough. The reality of his frailty was hitting me like a ton of bricks, and I knew that we were running out of time. I sat beside him one evening, wrapping a threadbare blanket around his shivering frame. His eyes were closed, his breathing labored, and for a moment, I feared that he had already slipped away. But then his eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with a weak smile. "Emma," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, "you're still here." "Of course I'm here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." He reached out, his trembling hand finding mine. His grip was weak, but I held onto him tightly, trying to transfer some of my warmth to him. "You've done so much for me," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "More than anyone ever has." "You don't have to thank me, Noah," I said, blinking back tears. "I want to help you. I wish I could do more." His eyes filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "You've already done more than enough. But Emma, you can't keep putting yourself in danger for me. It's not fair to you." I shook my head fiercely. "No, Noah, I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever." But as I said the words, I felt the weight of my own exhaustion settling over me. The constant fear, the cold, the hunger, it was all taking its toll, and I could feel myself nearing my breaking point. How much longer could I keep this up? How much longer could I keep both of us alive? That night, as Noah drifted in and out of sleep, I found myself staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. What if I couldn't save him? What if all my efforts were in vain? The thought of losing him, of losing the one person who had given my life purpose, was too much to bear. The next morning, I made the difficult decision to venture out further than I ever had before. There was a pharmacy a few miles away, and I knew it was our best chance to get the medicine Noah needed. But the trip would be dangerous. The streets were filled with people who wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of someone like me. A young woman alone and desperate. Still, I had to try. "I'm going to get you some medicine, Noah," I told him as I prepared to leave. He frowned, his expression a mix of concern and fear. "Emma, no, it's too dangerous. You don't have to do this." I forced a smile, trying to hide my own fear. "I have to, Noah. You're getting worse, and I can't just sit here and do nothing. I'll be careful, I promise." He shook his head, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." I leaned down, brushing the tear away gently. "You've given me a reason to keep going, Noah. I'm not giving up on you now." With that, I turned and left the shelter, the cold air hitting me like a wall as I stepped outside. The journey to the pharmacy felt like an eternity. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going, driven by the image of Noah's face, pale and frail, but still fighting. When I finally reached the pharmacy, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a sign that someone had been here before me. I knew the risks: looters, desperate people who would do anything to survive. But I had come too far to turn back now. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped inside. The shelves were mostly empty, ransacked by others who had come before me. But I searched frantically, refusing to leave without finding something, anything, that could help Noah. After what felt like hours, I found a small stash of medicine behind the counter, hidden away in a drawer. My hand shook as I grabbed the bottles, stuffing them into my bag. I could only pray that they would be enough. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise behind me, a low growl, followed by the sound of footsteps. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, coming face to face with a man I didn't recognize. His clothes were torn and dirty, his eyes wild with desperation. "What do you have there, girl?" he demanded, his voice rough and menacing. I backed away, clutching the bag to my chest. "I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need this for someone who's sick." He sneered, taking a step closer. "We're all sick. Hand it over, and maybe I'll let you leave in one piece." I felt a surge of panic, but I knew I couldn't give up the medicine. Noah's life depended on it. "Please," I begged, my voice trembling. "I just need to get back to him. He's dying." The man's expression softened for a moment, but then his eyes hardened again. "I don't care about your friend. I care about surviving. Now give me the bag." Desperation fueled my next move. Without thinking, I swung the bag at him, hitting him square in the chest. He stumbled back, caught off guard, and I took the opportunity to run. I didn't stop, even as I heard him curse and shout after me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out, but I kept going, the precious medicine clutched tightly in my arms. When I finally reached the shelter, I collapsed beside Noah, gasping for breath. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he looked at me in confusion. "Emma, what happened?" I shook my head, too exhausted to speak. Instead, I pulled the medicine from the bag and handed it to him, my hands still trembling. "I got it," I managed to say between gasps. "I got the medicine." His eyes filled with tears as he took the bottle from me, his hand shaking. You did all this for me." I nodded, feeling my own tears well up. "I couldn't lose you, Noah. I had to do something." He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. "You're stronger than you know, Emma. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." I shook my head, smiling through the tears. "You don't have to repay me. Just get better, okay? That's all I want." He nodded, swallowing the first dose of medicine with a grimace. I'll try. For you. As I sat beside him, watching the medicine take effect, I felt the weight of everything I had done settle over me. I had faced fear, danger, and the worst of humanity, but I had survived. And in that moment, I knew that I had reached my breaking point, but I hadn't broken. I had found a strength within myself that I never knew existed, and it was that strength that would see us through whatever came next. The bitter cold of winter had grown even more relentless, its icy fingers creeping into every crack and crevice of the small, makeshift shelter. The wind howled outside, shaking the flimsy walls and making the structure groan under its weight. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dampness and the faint metallic tang of illness. I sat beside Noah, my heart heavy as I watched him struggle to breathe. The medicine I had risked everything to get had helped, but only for a short while. Noah's condition had continued to worsen, his body weakened by years of hardship and neglect. He was now so frail that even the slightest movement caused him pain, and his once vibrant eyes had grown dull, clouded by the weight of impending death. I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. His skin was cold to the touch, a stark reminder of how little time we had left. "Noah," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm here." He turned his head slowly to look at me, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Emma," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You've been here every step of the way. You're my angel." Tears welled up in my eyes as I leaned closer, desperate to hold on to every word he said. "You're the one who gave me a reason to keep going," I replied, my voice trembling. "You've been my strength, Noah. I don't know what I'll do without you." His smile faltered, and for a moment, he seemed to be lost in thought. "You'll keep living, Emma. You'll keep fighting, like you've always done. You have a future, a life ahead of you. Don't let it slip away." I bit my lip, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't want to lose you," I confessed, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to say goodbye." He squeezed my hand weakly, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "You don't have to say goodbye, Emma. I'll always be with you in here." He touched his chest with his free hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "In your heart. Remember that, okay?" I nodded, unable to speak as the tears finally spilled down my cheeks. I wanted to tell him how much he meant to me, how much his presence had changed my life, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was hold on to him, hoping that somehow he could feel the depth of my love and gratitude. For a long while, we sat in silence, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the labored rhythm of Noah's breathing. I watched as his chest rose and fell, each breath a monumental effort. I could see the pain etched on his face, and it tore at my heart to know that there was nothing more I could do for him. "Emma." Noah's voice broke the silence, so soft that I had to lean in to hear him. I'm so tired." I nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I know, Noah. I know." He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. I think it's time." My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a deep, wrenching pain in my chest. This was it. The moment I had dreaded, the moment I had tried to prepare myself for, but no amount of preparation could make it any easier. I wrapped both of my hands around his, holding on as tightly as I could. "I'm here, Noah," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm right here. You're not alone." He nodded weakly, a small, peaceful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thank you, Emma," he murmured. "Thank you for everything." Tears streamed down my face as I leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I'll never forget you, Noah, I promise." His breathing grew shallower, each breath more labored than the last. I could see the life slowly slipping away from him, but I refused to let go. I held on to him with all the strength I had left, refusing to let him face this final moment alone. "Noah," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I love you." His eyes fluttered open one last time, and he looked at me with a tenderness that took my breath away. "I love you too, Emma," he replied, his voice so soft that it was almost lost in the wind. "Always." And then, with a final, shuddering breath, Noah closed his eyes, his hand going limp in mine. The shelter fell silent, the only sound the distant howl of the wind. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, holding on to him, refusing to accept that he was gone. When I finally found the strength to move, I gently laid him down, pulling the blanket up to his chin. His face was peaceful, freed from the pain that had plagued him in his final days. I wiped away my tears, my heart aching with a grief that felt too big to bear. But as I sat there, holding his hand for the last time, I remembered his words. He would always be with me, in my heart. And though the pain of losing him was overwhelming, I knew that he had given me a gift, a reason to keep going, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. I knew that I couldn't stay here, that I had to keep moving, keep living, just as Noah had told me. I took one last look at him, my heart heavy with sorrow, but also with gratitude for the time we had shared. "I'll keep fighting, Noah," I whispered, my voice filled with determination. "I'll keep living. For you." With that, I turned and walked out of the shelter, the wind biting at my face as I stepped into the cold night. The world felt emptier without him, but I knew that I carried a part of him with me, a part that would guide me through whatever came next. As I walked away, leaving the shelter, and Noah behind, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I had faced the darkest moment of my life, and though I had lost someone I loved, I had also found a strength within myself that I never knew existed. And with that strength, I would continue to move forward, carrying Noah's memory with me always.